Man, has it been a while since I made one of these, huh? The Best and Worst series is back with a vengeance, and today I'm tackling the Men in Black movies. These movies, especially the first two, were a big part of a lot of people's childhoods, but I never watched them growing up, so this can be an unbiased review of these films. I'm going to talk spoilers with all of them, so the time codes for the different films are in the description if you want to skip around. Also, yes, I will be referring to J and K as Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones in this video. Just a heads up, I know what the characters' names are. Let's get to it. The first Men in Black, a 90s classic. Keeping in mind that I have no nostalgia bias for this movie, did I enjoy it? Yeah, I did. I think this is a very fun summer blockbuster. I didn't realize before watching this that this is actually based on a Marvel comic, but regardless of where it came from, this premise is perfect for this sort of goofy fun blockbuster. The cast is great, mainly the main two actors. This is peak Will Smith, before he was turned into a meme, and then a meme again, and now is an Instagram comedian?
Okay. Forget it.
Not really sure what's happening there, but this is when he was at the peak of his movie stardom in my opinion. The 90s. And there's a reason for that. He is a very fun, charismatic actor, and I think him and Tommy Lee Jones are perfectly cast in their roles in this movie. You want to have the older, no-nonsense, by-the-books officer, and the new, inexperienced, unorthodox officer buddy cop dynamic? 90s Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones are the perfect way to go. They play off each other very well, and both are great in this movie. And together, they create some really funny moments. When they're together especially, this is quite a funny film. It is silly and goofy with some of the comedy, but you know, that's part of the fun. It's meant to be a silly and goofy movie. Granted, there are some jokes that don't land or go on for a bit too long, but in general, it's quite a funny film. It has humor and heart and charismatic stars, and it all comes together to be a very fun experience. The action is also fun, again, in that goofy way, but that is the film's style, and it works quite well for that. The story of the film, with Will Smith learning to be a Men in Black agent and working with the more experienced Tommy Lee Jones agent, is not a crazy original story, but it works really well here. The story reminded me a bit of Kingsman in parts, which is a film I love. I know that came after this, but I'm not saying Kingsman copied this. I guess I'm just saying that's an enjoyable story when done right. Also, just the Men in Black outfit. It's simple, but cool. There's a reason it's iconic now. Plus, it provided everyone with a great last-minute Halloween costume idea.
I am one of the Men in Black guys. Can I have your sunglasses?
Also, the whole concept of the neuralizer, I don't know if that came from the comic or if they made it up for this movie, but that's a very fun, creative idea in this story that I really enjoyed, and it also helps to lead to an actually pretty sweet ending. I mean, this ending isn't super developed and that character payoff feels a bit rushed, but considering this is a 90-minute silly action comedy, it's a nice wholesome ending, alright? It made me smile. Also, that final ending with the galaxy reveal, really fun way to end this kind of movie. Okay, when I said earlier that I hadn't seen these movies as a kid, that was a partial lie, because I started watching the first Men in Black with my family when I was really young, and that farm scene with Vincent D'Onofrio terrified me so much that I was like, you know what, I'm good, I think I'll go watch something else right now. Watching it now, all these years later, it did sort of amuse and surprise me how brutal this is for, essentially, a kid's movie. Like, the villain character gets quite a few kills in there that would have scared me as a little kid, as that first one did. But like I've said before, I think those kinds of moments in kids' movies that are scary to you as a kid, but aren't actually bad at all in hindsight, are an important part of watching movies growing up. Having those stories you can talk about later that a kid's movie had a part that freaked you out. So, I'm all for that in this, especially because it isn't actually that bad, and the movie still stays fun and goofy. Also, it adds a bit of tension to the story, that the villain does some pretty brutal things, you know? And D'Onofrio overacts as both a human and an alien, but it works for this kind of movie. In terms of visual effects, this did impress me a bit. There were some effects that genuinely looked quite good. A mix of practical effects and CGI was clearly used at points, and it looks quite convincing. Other effects aren't great. There is some bad late 90s, early 2000s type bouncy CGI that looks quite rubbery. But like I've said a lot so far, and maybe it's starting to seem like an excuse, it does contribute a bit to the charm of this film. I think there's definitely something to be said for films that are pretty timeless, like in terms of story and effects and all that. Like even if it's from the 80s, it still looks good today. But on the other hand, in certain cases, such as this film, the fact that it doesn't hold up that well today and it looks a bit rubbery doesn't really bother me. It's part of what makes the film what it is, and there is a charm to how it captures that time period well, down to the effects that maybe aren't the best now. Plus, it's not like this movie is trying to be super realistic. It is a silly movie. It wasn't supposed to look ultra realistic even at the time, so that makes me even less bothered by it. So it's not like something like Jurassic Park, where those dinosaurs are meant to look very realistic, and that's part of why it's so impressive that they still do to this day. Little tangent that relates to this. Recently, I rewatched Freaky Friday from 2003 with my family. Don't judge me, alright? That is a great movie, and I really enjoyed how early 2000s it is. Like the style and the music and the clothes and the characters, it's a great time capsule for this kind of movie of that time period. A while ago, Nathan Zed, one of my favorite YouTubers, made a really great point about visual effects in older movies, and I'm gonna play that clip right now.
There's something about the special effects from 2002, they're just not as good as 2019. It's like, duh, how are you gonna be mad at a computer in 1980 for not being a computer in 2019? Why does everything have to hold up today?
I don't think that excuses all bad visual effects in films, as we'll get to a little bit later, but in this movie, when the CGI is noticeably kind of rubbery, it does play more into the fun of the movie and the world, rather than it being detrimental. The music is also great in this, very distinctive and fits the style of the movie very well, plus the iconic MIB rap is in there, can't very well go without mentioning that. In terms of what I didn't like in this film, it does have a bit of a weird pace and some odd editing choices towards the start. There's sometimes no real transition between scenes, sometimes the plot moves a bit too quickly, sometimes characters just reveal things without any real proper build-up. I don't want the movie to drag on, but giving some of those scenes a bit more time to breathe would have helped with this, especially in the first third of the movie. This is more of a minor complaint, because this isn't meant to be a realistic movie at all, but it still did bother me a bit that, especially at the start of the film, characters are extremely casual about this alien stuff, especially Will Smith, and then also Laurel. Like, they don't act completely unfazed, but they act way more normal than I feel they should, especially since Will Smith is like the point of view character into this world. I don't know, I mean, it is improved on later. Will Smith acts more like how a normal person would in these situations later in the film, and again, it's not terrible or anything, it did just bug me a little bit. And on that note of complaints that aren't really complaints because of the type of movie this is, there are some dumb plot points, like the villain finding the spaceship because of a postcard. There are some dumb moments in the action, but again, silly fun blockbuster that doesn't take itself too seriously. It's kind of part of the charm, you know? So overall, Men in Black. If I'm honest, I wasn't expecting too much. I thought it might be one of those movies that's regarded fondly because of nostalgia, but realistically isn't that great. But it turned out to be a very fun movie. Great performances, funny moments, goofy style that works for this kind of film. If you're willing to settle into and accept this style and ignore the dumb moments that sometimes accompany it, this is a fun time. Not the best movie ever, had a few complaints with it, but overall a very enjoyable film. I'll give Men in Black 1 a 7.9 out of 10. Okay, so Men in Black 1 pleasantly surprised me. I quite enjoyed it. Wish I could say the same for Men in Black 2. Alright, Men in Black 2. Now, in advance, I just want to say, I'm sorry if you love this movie, and if it was part of your childhood and that kind of stuff. Like what you like, more power to you. I'm not trying to take that away from you. But I'm not going to shy away from the fact that I personally hated this movie. Okay, let's start with the pros though, because this movie isn't completely without any merit. Like the first film, the score is quite good here again. There are some decent costumes and sets. Some effects are okay. Big emphasis on the word some in that sentence. More on that later. There are some kind of fun moments, like the tiny world inside the locker, or the alien language bit. It still has some of the cheesy fun charm of the first film, mainly coming from the cast. Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones are still very charismatic, and they are fun together, although this time, the writing for them is not as good. And on that note, let's just dive into what I did not like about this movie. Let's first talk about action and visual effects. The visual effects here are some of the worst I've ever seen in a big budget movie. Not only is there bad CGI, which I'd say is worse than the first movie, and as a result doesn't add to the charm really in the same way, the rest of the movie not being as good also doesn't help, but there's also some truly horrendous green screen at points. Multiple scenes also feel like they're in the movie just to show off some visual effects, which makes some scenes feel very shoehorned in, and then on top of that, those visual effects oftentimes are terrible. The action in general is also bad. It's not like the action in the first film was amazing, but especially due to the poor effects, there's nothing that engaging about the action in the film. Besides, there isn't a lot of action anyway. The humor in general also really fell flat for me in this movie. A lot of the jokes feel overplayed or just lazy, and personally, not a lot of it worked for me. Also, that part where Rip Torn does karate, it felt like something out of a parody movie, like Scary Movie or something. But this isn't a parody movie. It's a moment where it's not good enough to be genuinely funny, but it's not so bad that it's funny. It's just bad. These are ridiculous movies, but that kind of moment took it too far, where it's so ridiculous that it isn't really funny anymore. This film has one of the problems of the first, which is that it's badly edited and paced. But it's much worse than the first film with that, because it continues throughout the entire movie, instead of mostly just being at the start. Because of the editing, it almost doesn't feel like a real movie sometimes, or like a final product. It's really choppy and lacks a proper sense of flow, and some scenes just don't have a proper start or end, like that prisoners scene. Or some scenes just don't seem to have a point. It cuts seemingly just randomly sometimes. It's very odd. This film's script is also bad. A lot of plot elements are more dumb and ridiculous than the first film, to the point where it passes the fun, silly action comedy where the plot isn't going to be super intricate, to, oh, this is just dumb at this point. The plot of the film is very simple and bland, and yet still has a ton of holes in it, and really dumb moments. There are also a lot of retreads of the first film, plot and joke-wise, but this movie lacks any of the heart or most of the charm of that first film. The conflicts feel very forced, partly because they go by so quickly. Any possible emotional moments that could come from character conflicts or arcs just have no time to develop. It's like it's just going through the motions. Like this new conflict with J and K, which, to give them some credit, at least it isn't exactly the same conflict as the first film, but it isn't given any real time to properly develop. And the end of the film twist with Rosario Dawson, again, everything is so rushed in this movie that even a twist that isn't necessarily bad just doesn't really mean anything to you, because you weren't really given any time to get invested in it. This movie is already really short, and then spends too much time on jokes that don't hit, and so in the end, character and plot-wise, nothing is built up properly. It really feels like a direct-to-DVD movie to me, with the effects as well. Speaking of Rosario Dawson, the romance in this film feels super forced for similar reasons. It's just not given any time to actually be anything noteworthy. They're not even bad performances from the two actors, but just the writing and the pacing lead to it falling flat. I also didn't really enjoy how much this movie ruins the first movie, just so there could be a sequel. I mean, I like that Tommy Lee Jones is back, because the dynamic between him and Smith is one of the few things I kind of enjoyed in this film, but the way they do it, it doesn't feel like they had a really good idea for bringing him back. It just feels like they were told to make a sequel and find some way to bring him back, and they were like, yeah, this'll do. Funnily enough, with the first film reminding me of Kingsman, this reminded me a bit of Kingsman 2 in that way, also with the two characters' roles being switched a bit. But then you also have Kay's wife leaving him, which pretty much ruins the end of the first Men in Black. You have Laurel from the first movie gone just because of reasons. The excuse given for that is quite flimsy, which I also was annoyed by, because I thought the ending of her and Smith now working together as agents was quite a fun one. I get if you couldn't get that actress back for the sequel, but then come up with a better reason for her not being there. And also, this movie walks back the character arcs from the last film. Kay is more of a dick again, Jay is more stupid and incompetent again, they don't really trust or like each other as much again. It ruins the first film just so it can retread a lot of its plot points. That's two annoying decisions from a story perspective in one. Also, as much as I enjoy Jones and Smith together, there are points in this film where Tommy Lee Jones' performance feels a bit phoned in, not gonna lie. So, Men in Black 2, I really disliked it. No, it isn't the worst movie ever, that role is still reserved for Planet 51. I see you, Planet 51, I'll get to you one day. But it's still pretty bad. Honestly, if you're binge watching this franchise, I fully think you can just skip this one. It's a lot like the first one, if the first one wasn't as well made or as fun. So if that sounds like it's up your alley, then give it a shot, but in my opinion, not essential viewing. I'll give Men in Black 2 a 3 out of 10. Again, apologies to everyone who loves this movie. No hate to you, like what you like. I am absolutely not saying everyone should feel the same way as me. It's just my opinion. Next up, Men in Black. To be honest, after Men in Black 2, I was not expecting much from Men in Black 3. Plus, it came out like 10 years after the first two, and those many years later sequels can potentially just be cash grabs. So, I was very pleasantly surprised when I found that this was maybe my favorite of the series, or at least on the same level as the first one. I quite enjoyed watching this. I thought it was a fun time that didn't take itself too seriously. It was pretty good for what it was. I do think my experience with the second one did really elevate this film, because I was so happy to be watching a movie that just felt like a movie again. Like, it's better paced, scenes actually have a proper start and end, there's more purpose and energy behind the story, it feels like a movie. And beyond that, I think it's actually a very fun movie. What I really enjoyed about this is the premise. You could read that premise and think, that's jumping the shark a bit, but for this already fun, silly franchise, the idea of a time travel adventure actually works really well. Yeah, it's ridiculous and has plot holes, but these movies are ridiculous, and at least this time, this leads to an interesting and fun story. I also enjoy that they get around the fact that such a big element like time travel hasn't been mentioned yet, by just saying that it was above Smith's pay grade. That's a funny way to acknowledge a plot hole like that. The whole thing with Will Smith going back to work with young Tommy Lee Jones actually makes for a really enjoyable movie, it turns out. Josh Brolin also is perfect as a young Tommy Lee Jones. Not only does he look a lot like him, but he's dead on as a younger version of the character we know from the other two films. He's not just doing an impression though, he's fun in his own way as well. And him and Smith work really well together, much like how Jones and Smith work well together. They even have some decent emotional moments. Nothing crazy that'll make you bawl, but much better than anything in the second movie, and at least on par with everything in the first movie. At least. I will say, something that bothers me a bit about this franchise is the relationship between Kay and Jay. Or, sorry, as I would refer to them as Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, like the professional that I am. Because while they do have a fun dynamic, these movies are quite inconsistent with how well it seems they actually know each other. After all the time between the first movie and the third movie, you'd think they'd have a closer relationship after all those years. But in this movie, it feels like they've only known each other while the movies themselves were occurring, and there's been no development between movies, because their relationship doesn't feel like there's been 10 years of it in their interactions. Then, I actually like that they kind of address that they've known each other for over a decade and still get into the same kind of fights, and Brolin is like, how do you sit in a car for a decade and not talk? And Smith is like, exactly. That's actually kind of interesting that they address it. Kind of, again, cheapens their characters growing closer in the first Men in Black, but whatever. But then the movie also shows that Smith does know stuff about Kay, like they've been friends for years. And I don't know, the inconsistency in that part of the story, while not a huge problem, does bug me a bit. It kind of feels like they almost reset the relationship every movie, like what they learned in the previous films just doesn't mean anything. Doesn't ruin the films, but it's still something that bugged me. But yeah, back to the time travel stuff. I also enjoyed the 1960s stuff, it led to some funny moments, and speaking of which, the movie is decently funny. Some jokes don't hit, but even the jokes that fall flat aren't cringeworthy like they were in the last one. And then quite a few of the jokes actually are funny. A couple of them actually made me laugh out loud.
Damn it, it's not the tick!
The whole Andy Warhol thing is also pretty fun. The villain in this movie is kind of fun. He's over the top, yeah, and I think the talking to himself thing by the finale got a bit tiresome and not very funny. Same with the whole Boris the Animal bit, but overall, not a bad villain, especially for this sort of movie. Also, I enjoyed that with that villain, it goes back to the more brutal type of stuff, for a kid's film, that the first movie did. Really, the movie feels a lot like the first film in terms of its style, even down to the visual style of the first film. Luke Cage shows up in this movie. He's solid in it. The reveal that he's Will Smith's dad is interesting, but a bit confusing. I mean, for one, wouldn't that make Will Smith older than he actually is? And it also adds a whole new layer to the franchise of Destiny in a way, which I don't like as much as Will Smith just being more of an average guy who gets sucked into this world. But overall, not a bad twist. It was kind of interesting. Tommy Lee Jones's and/or Josh Brolin's arc in this movie also isn't bad. Again, it does sort of disregard the first movie's ending, but considering they were going to make more of these and had to have some kind of character arc for him, this wasn't bad. In terms of action and visual effects, this is pretty good. There are the occasional bad effects. Smith jumping off the building could look a bit better. In general, though, most of the visual effects are quite good, and the makeup and sets and costumes and all that is also really solid all around, especially seen with the Men in Black headquarters and with creating the 1960s world. Good music like the other films, and some really solid action too. This probably has the best and most exciting action of any of the Men in Black films, to be honest. And the finale of the film is also pretty exciting. The Doctor Strange time loop type solution was quite fun. In conclusion, Men in Black 3 was a really enjoyable watch. It didn't give me a headache like 2 did, and felt like an actual movie, so that's already a bonus. But beyond that, it's actually quite good in my opinion. It isn't just competent, it's also fun. I was never bored while watching it. It has good performances, solid action and effects, some funny moments, fun premise that, yes, opens up a billion questions if you actually think about it for a second. But for this kind of movie that doesn't take itself too seriously, didn't really bother me. I realize that I may be giving this excuse for this kind of movie a lot in this video, but I do keep wanting to stress that these kind of minor plot holes, or a silly element of the film maybe not really making that much sense, to me doesn't bother me when that clearly isn't the point of the films, and it doesn't hurt the film's flow or fun in a major way. Like if this was something that was meant to be very technical, like Interstellar, or that one about time travel that I haven't seen but is apparently very technical, I'll put that on the screen right now, there it matters more. In these kind of movies, I can be more forgiving of that. And parts of these films is where it gets pushed a little bit too far. But anyway, bit of a ramble here. Back to the conclusion. No, this movie isn't perfect, but overall, I had a lot of fun with it. I'll also give it a 7.9 out of 10. I think it's at least just as good as the first one. Also, based on the strength of this movie in particular, I'm actually quite sad that the Jump Street crossover that they were thinking of never happened. Because I think that could have been spectacular, for lots of reasons. Anyway, moving on to the next film. And then we've come to the grand finale, which wasn't really grand and wasn't really meant to be a finale either. It was meant to kickstart a new franchise. But after its performance at the box office, I think this will be the last Men in Black movie we see for quite a few years. Everyone absolutely hated this movie when it came out. It was named as one of the worst movies of the year. I won't even lie, this video was supposed to be made a long time ago, but I put it off just because I didn't want to have to sit through this movie. That's how bad I'd heard this was. And so imagine my surprise when I sat down to watch it, and it's actually not terrible. Don't get me wrong, it's not great, or even good, really, but it was certainly not as bad as I was expecting. I think I probably enjoyed it more than I otherwise would have because my expectations were absolutely rock bottom, because realistically, it is a bad movie. I think I was just happily surprised that it was at least watchable. Firstly, cast-wise, I actually don't think this is bad at all. Hemsworth and Thompson are charismatic, and they have decent chemistry with each other, and other supporting actors like Emma Thompson and Rafe Spall are pretty solid too. I think the problem more lies in the writing, and that these charismatic actors aren't given much to work with. For a lot of the film, it feels like these actors are really trying to make the best of a pretty bad script. Two generally great actors, who I was not impressed with here, are Liam Neeson, which I know it's kind of a meme, he just phones in performances in a lot of films these days, but this is one of the most phoned in performances I've seen in a while. He really seems like he just doesn't want to be there, and is putting in just enough effort to get his paycheck, and then he'll be on his way. And on the other end of the spectrum, Kumail Nanjiani, who is a very funny actor in general, is clearly trying to make his character work, so props for that, but the writing for his character is so bad that he can't even save it. At least Tessa Thompson and Chris Hemsworth kind of pull together some fun moments with just their natural charm and on-screen chemistry, but Kumail can't, and I think that probably has something to do with him being a CGI character, so he has less ways to actually salvage that writing. But I don't think I laughed a single time at one of his jokes, and basically all he says are jokes the whole movie. On the actual characters of Molly and H, I think the idea for the character of Molly has potential, knowing about aliens and the Men in Black and working her way to find them, although I'm not sure why the Men in Black wouldn't neuralize her as well as a child, just because she may have been asleep. But it doesn't really go anywhere that interesting, especially after she joins Men in Black. The main thing it leads to is a terrible plot twist, which we'll talk about later. But her and Chris Hemsworth don't have as distinct or consistent characters as there were in the previous films. They do have their own arcs and traits, but sometimes it feels like their characters are more secondary to what the plot needs. Like their characters will mold for the needs of the plot. And it feels like this movie was more built on the idea of Tessa Thompson and Chris Hemsworth being funny together, and not on the idea of these two characters. Or the characters aren't even extremely inconsistent, but there are just times where they ramp up certain traits to the point of unbelievability, like Hemsworth's cartoonish idiocy. I don't know, the Men in Black movies are over the top, but here it just felt harder to get invested in these characters because they felt more like these two charismatic actors reading whatever was written for the scene, rather than two actual characters. The villains were alright in this. I mean, there's barely anything to them character-wise, but visually, they have a pretty decent design. They had a bit of a lights-out type entrance, and I like that this stays true to that Men in Black brutalness for the villains. Speaking of which, this really does feel like it fits in with the Men in Black franchise aesthetically. I mean, with the music, with the cinematography, it has that type of visual style that the first film had. It's just lacking a lot of the charm of 1 and 3. Also, while the score is fine, I did think some of the other music choices here weren't great, and didn't really fit in that well. The plot is a bit messy and moves forward in some silly or stupid ways, but that isn't anything that new for this franchise. The pacing is a bit off. For example, it moves very quickly towards the start in terms of Tessa Thompson just getting the job at MIB, but I guess this isn't the kind of movie that wants to spend a while actually setting up how the sort of plot could realistically get going. It's more interested in getting straight into the main adventure. There are a few twists in this, and largely they're quite bad. The worst one in my opinion being that the alien thug that's working for the bad guy is the alien that Tessa Thompson met at the beginning of the film. It's very contrived and coincidental, but what makes that worse is that that's how they don't die in that scene. Like, that plot point is a key element of the story. The rest of the film after that moment couldn't happen if that wasn't the case. And so the fact that it's so coincidental makes it feel like an extremely cheap way to get these characters out of that spot. I gotta say, also, this movie is so messy at points that it doesn't even do a misdirect correctly. I think they maybe were trying to do a misdirect that C is the traitor, or maybe it's secretly Chris Hemsworth and he's part of the Hive, but they spend so little time on it and just brush past it so quickly that even if you couldn't predict Liam Neeson would be the villain in the end, it still wouldn't work as a misdirect. It's so rushed and feels like stuff was cut out that it's almost confusing why they included certain moments at times. And again, it makes this obvious twist all the more obvious. I will say the one decent twist in the movie is that Hemsworth had his memory erased by Neeson, not because it isn't predictable, but just because that's actually a kind of interesting idea for that character, although it isn't developed much more beyond that. In terms of the humor, I've already complained about the Kumail character. Again, more the fault of the writing than Kumail, but honestly, it's not all bad. This is such a mixed bag humor-wise, because some jokes actually got a chuckle out of me. They're not the best jokes ever, but some of them, even if they're a bit obvious, Hemsworth and Thompson do a decent job of selling, especially Hemsworth. However, for every joke that got a chuckle out of me, there are a few that don't hit home. There are quite a few cringeworthy moments and one-liners.
Check, please.
And there are some really lame and oftentimes outdated references in here.
Ugh, what is this, the sequel to The Notebook?
In terms of effects and action, in a very similar way, also a very mixed bag. There are definitely some decent visual effects, and there is some decent action. The villains' powers especially actually lead to some pretty interesting action scenes. Their initial fight with the agents is actually quite a good action scene. Other times, the action is very bare bones and forgettable. Several times throughout the film, the green screen is awful, like in that alien bike scene, some horrendous green screen, which really hurts what otherwise could be a pretty fun chase scene, and there's also Molly in the portal at the end. Doesn't look great. Some sets look good, and then others look really fake, almost like a Justice League type thing, where it feels like it's just on this tiny set that's then surrounded by green screens. I'm looking at you, Eiffel Tower set. Some alien CGI is fine, and then some is quite poor. Like, the cartoony look of some of the aliens is totally fine for this kind of film, but then other times, it's just not very good CGI. Again, in 2019, it's harder to excuse than in 1997. And if they're trying to do it as a throwback to the first film, it's not done consistently enough for it to work. It's more that sometimes the effects are solid, and then other times, they aren't. In conclusion, Men in Black International isn't exceptional in any way, really, but that also means it isn't totally awful. If you go in with low expectations and can ignore some of the more cringeworthy and dumb moments, it's surprisingly bearable. What a glowing review, huh? You know what, I think it's a bit more than bearable, actually. It's just there's a lot that's not great here. But overall, my reaction is more positive than it might otherwise have been, because I was expecting a train wreck, and I don't think it was that. I'll give Men in Black International a 4.9 out of 10. So if I were to rank these 4 movies, I'd say Men in Black 1 and 3 tied for first, then International, then 2. Boom. So, those are my thoughts on the Men in Black films. What do you think of these, and how would you rank them? Let me know all of your thoughts down below in the comments. While you're at it, be sure to like this video, check out my Instagram and Twitter at BHL_Hudson, check out this podcast about movies and TV I do with a friend of mine called The Poorly Planned Podcast, and subscribe for more videos like the one you just watched. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.